Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. At least it is evening here in South Asia.
Okay.
And a very warm welcome to you all from our team here at Naya Daur. This is the first sort of discussion in a series of interviews that we hope to be doing with authors of important new books, which will help us understand better both our past and our present. And our first guest, and this is long overdue, uh, for our first such broadcast is Muk Sharma. Uh, who's an author and journalist based in New Delhi in India. He is news editor at the Times of India, and now he's author of the recently published book Allahu Akbar: Understanding the Great Mughal in Today's India, which has of course stirred up much discussion in India and beyond. And his work has been described uh, holding a mirror to today's India. It's been described as a passionate plea for understanding the value of what he calls the magnificent rule of the Mughal emperor. Uh, so, welcome, Manimugdha Sharma, to our broadcast, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, these are, of course, extraordinary
Thank you very much.
descriptions. For a book on an early modern emperor of the northern half of the Indian subcontinent. So we're talking a man who ruled from Kabul to Bengal, or perhaps more. Uh, but then, the Mughals were, of course, an extraordinary dynasty, and Akbar was certainly, uh, in some ways, extraordinary among them. And Muk Sharma's work of course, highlights all of this, and we will, of course, be asking him about it all. We'll also perhaps take a question or two from the audience if the time and format permit. And hopefully, by the end of our discussion today, we will have a better idea of not just the man behind the image, but of why sort of Akbar causes so much tension with South Asian identity today, and why he is perhaps why he's not sort of Hindu enough for India, and perhaps not sort of Islamic enough for Pakistan, and then how sort of Manimugdha Sharma's work sort of grapples with these issues. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask you, um, when you were doing your research for your book, right? So, what aspects of Akbar's rule, his reign, sort of immediately stood out for someone who's so involved with media and with current events in the 21st century, a journalist as well, such as yourself, an author, researcher, such as yourself. So, when you delve into that history, what aspects of his rule sort of stood out most and became important themes in your book?
Mhm. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on your show. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I think, as you said, that it's been due for a long time. We have spoken about it, but never really got the opportunity to do this. And finally, we are doing
Yeah,
it now.
yeah.
It should not have been really difficult because, we're just across the border. So I think that also speaks for the times that we live in, that we had to take. I mean,
Mm.
people abroad have spoken to me about it, but next door, we have not been able to have this conversation. So that is the
Yeah.
tragedy of our time. So on that note, I would like to begin because this is precisely the reason why Akbar caught my attention. And I have made it absolutely clear in the introduction of my book that, circumstances 2015 onwards became such that something had to be done. Some misconceptions had to be cleared, some myths had to be busted. And the trigger was provided by our ruling party here, where one of the spokesperson compared Akbar to Adolf Hitler, and that was really the beginning of my intervention in 2015. So I did a series of articles in the Times of India. I did also a video thing as a kind of a myth buster. And so my publisher had seen all of that. And then eventually they asked me in 2017 if I could expand the thought in the form of a book, which I did. Now, Akbar, of course, is somebody who is most loved in India. While I was growing up, there were so many Akbar Birbal tales, and Akbar was like a household name. The Mughals. And even though a binary was always thrown at us, where Akbar was the good Muslim and Aurangzeb was the bad Muslim, but by and large, people still took the Mughals very positively because the understanding was that they were an Indian dynasty, as they truly were. That they were an Indian dynasty, they were our kings and emperors, and we visit their palaces or their built architectural legacy that they have left behind. So we have enjoyed all of that. So growing up, I enjoyed all of that. And so I already had an image of Akbar in my mind, and I think that's true about for many Indian children. Because when you grow up hearing tales about Akbar, where very modern labels are applied on him, like that he was a secular king, that he was a liberal monarch, and so on. So these are very modern terms. We could not apply these labels on Akbar, but that's the kind of understanding that we always had. The historical Akbar was, of course, much different. So we always get a very goody-goody image of Akbar, but of course we forget often that he was a 16th century absolute monarch, a despot. So that is something that we often forget. So I actually began my research keeping in mind that he was a 16th century man. And because I thought that way, I was in fact stunned to find out so many things about Akbar that were very remarkable for his time. The fact that he refused to subject his rationality or his reasoning to dogmas of faith, I think, is remarkable for a 16th century individual. And the fact that he was talking about having a common ground for people of diverse faiths to stand together, I think is again quite remarkable. And the fact that we don't see this very often in other empires. So, for instance, the most obvious comparison of the Mughals happens with the Ottomans and the Safavids. And of course, they were also remarkable in their own ways, but we see that the Mughals were far different from the rest of them. Even though initially they did have these sectarian considerations, but we do see that by the time Akbar comes on the throne, and this legacy, in fact, is extended by his successors, that they bring people from diverse faiths into the Mughal administration, into the Mughal state system. So they all become part of it, which I think is quite rare for that century. And then for 16th and 17th centuries, they were like the dominant star on the world political map. And they did so much, and Akbar, in fact, started all of it. So I didn't know, for instance, that, of course, I was a student of history. I have a master's in that. But of course, in the university, you don't have a very deep engagement with characters, because you study these empires, these times as a whole. So you don't really focus on individuals. And in fact, I personally don't believe in that great man theory. So historical forces tend to shape. There are forces far greater than individuals that shape histories of people, of places. So, but then once I started digging up more and more about Akbar, I figured that there were so many remarkable things about him. For instance, the fact that an Indian king could think about challenging the authority of the Ottomans when the Ottoman authority was at its pinnacle, with Suleiman, the Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, being there. So at that time, Akbar was thinking about challenging the authority of the Ottomans. And in fact, he patronized Mecca and Medina. So these are holy places. And the fact that he did something like that, he could think beyond the immediate borders of his empire. I think that was very remarkable. The man, that he was aware of what he wanted to do, and then exactly whom he had to challenge in order to establish his authority. I think that's very remarkable about Akbar. And also the fact that there were so many other things in his personal life, which I think would be very difficult for many people to do. Being an Orthodox, coming from an Orthodox Sunni background, the fact that he started observing Hindu practices, the fact that he had these discussions with Christians, and he in fact started wearing Christian dresses at one point on holy occasions, and the fact that he would wear the tilak as Hindus would do, that he would tie the kaleva around his wrists as Hindus would do, the fact that he would chant 1,000 names of the sun god, which he learned from the Jains. So these are things which make him quite remarkable for his time, no doubt. But at the end of the day, we also need to remember that when we do this hero worship, which we often do with historical characters, we need to remember that they were products of their times. So I think that's the idea that I had in my mind when I started researching about Akbar. Sorry to give you a very long-winded answer, but
No, no, you've actually touched upon quite a few of the issues that I'm hoping to sort of go into as we go
Mhm,
along. So it's good that we sort of have a bit of an introduction to them.
mhm,
And I also want to take this opportunity to do something which I'm sure you'll approve of, which is a shout out to our friends at the Mughal Imperial Archives, who have been doing some
mhm,
excellent work on Facebook and on Twitter now and on social media in general. They have been very kind not only to tune in, but they actually also have sort of shared information about this discussion that we're having sort of on their page, which is actually a great honor for me, at least personally. So thank you so much to our friends at the Mughal Imperial Archives. People, please sort of tune in to the content that they share on a daily basis. But we are going to move on to uh, first we need to get some of the sort of the historian stuff out of the way, because that's, I think that's very important as well. So I wanted to ask you about sources, right? So you
mhm.
delve into sources, you roll your sleeves back and you go into them. So what sort of sources were you looking at to help you to sort of paint a picture of what Akbar's personality was like, what his court was like, what his era was like, and how difficult did you find it to actually sort of, as a modern Indian, to research early modern sort of South Asia under the Mughals?
Mhm. So, when it comes to researching early modern South Asia, it's not very difficult because you have the most number of sources for this period. In fact, it's more difficult to look for history of ancient India before 10th century than it is of the Mughals, because they are very well documented, and they're not just by Indian sources but also by foreign sources. All kinds of travelers were coming. They had the liaisons with foreign courts. So obviously, a lot of records were maintained. So for that reason, sources were never really a problem. I chose to focus mostly on the primary sources. So it is for Akbar, it has to be the Akbarnama and Ain Akbari, which is a part of that. And of course, Mullah Abdul Qadir Badauni's Muntakhab al-Tawarikh. These
Mm,
are like the two primary sources. Then you have Nizamuddin Ahmad's Tabaqat Akbari. So, and of course, if you have to talk about Humayun, because you can't really jump to Akbar, right? You have to also talk about
right.
Humayun when you're talking about the history of Akbar. So I also focused on Juan the Mir's uh, a chronicle of Humayun's life. So these are all the primary sources. Gulbadan Begum's Humayun Nama. I also focused on the Babar Nama. I also focused on the Tuzuka Jahangiri. So, all these primary sources I consulted. Yes, I consulted most of them in English, the translated ones, but I consulted different versions of translated accounts because at that time my Persian skills were non-existent. I could read Urdu, as you know, I still can. But over time, I have acquired Persian skills as well. So now I can read some documents, but back then I could not. So I relied entirely on these translated sources. But of course, I did consult with various historians, Professor Nadeem Rizvi, for instance, at the Aligarh Muslim University, Professor Irfan Habib, Professor Iqtidar Alam Khan. So these are people I used to call Professor Harbans Mukhia. They were the people who were guiding me constantly. So there would be references in Farsi which I would struggle to figure out, and then I would call up Nadeem Saab and I'll ask him, "What does this mean?" And then he would tell me all. So sources that way were clearly not a problem. But yes, because I was also trying to position Akbar in the global context, even in the 16th century. So I had to look at histories of other countries and places as well. So I was looking at the history of the Ottomans, of the Safavids. I was going far back in time, looking at the Roman Empire, looking at the Greeks, also cycling forward to Europe in the 19th and the 20th centuries, the Second World War, Germany versus the Soviet Union. These are the kind of things that I was also talking about. So if anyone who reads my book would figure out why exactly I was doing that. But the sources arena was pretty vast for me. So that was I had to read quite a bit. So first 2 years actually went into reading all of that. So uh,
Right. So,
and
yeah, go on, please.
and of course, then there were other sources as well, like for instance, the Rajputana versions, the Rajput Chronicles as well, translated ones, of course, or those that were available in Hindi. So I did consult some of them. But mostly these were the primary sources. I also read some of the secondary material because it was important to see how Akbar was being analyzed by different scholars over different periods of time. Uh, Colonial historians, how did they perceive him in the 19th century or in the early 20th century? How did nationalist historians see him? How did left historians, Marxist historians, how did they see him? So I had to look at
Hmm.
all of these perspectives as well. So I think I can't claim that I have done a comprehensive job, but at least I did make an attempt. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Uh, okay, so about sort of the, because you've also touched upon this in your response to my first question about what sort of stands out about Akbar's rule. So briefly, could you talk about a bit more about some of the things that will make him stand out when you compare him to contemporaries like the Ottomans, the Safavids, in Iran, the Ming in China, these sort of so-called gunpowder empires in particular.
Mhm.
What about Akbar makes him sort of stand out when compared to contemporaries or relative contemporaries such as uh, Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, who is known in the West as Suleiman the
Mhm.
Magnificent, or with Ismail the Safavid, or with with
Mhm.
other with Shah Abbas, for instance.
Mhm.
What are we looking at here? What makes him sort of interesting, even when placed alongside his contemporaries?
Mhm. Yeah, of course, you have Akbar's personality, which puts him apart from the rest of them, and of course, like I said, the Mughals, they were really different from the Safavids and the Ottomans. They at least the Ottomans were also Turkic people, but of course of an earlier vintage. So they're very different that way, and of course, we have to understand that the Mughals didn't just come with their Timurid ideas. They also came with the Mongol ideas, which they had inherited from their maternal side, right? So, for instance,
Right.
the Yasai Chingizi, the code of conduct, which it was more a professional code, but of course, it did believe in treating people equally, based on your abilities, not
From
on your
Chinggis Khan,
birth.
this quote. Yeah.
Genghis Khan, yes, absolutely. And if
Yeah.
you remember,
Yeah.
I'm sure you have studied the Genghis Khan's history as well. So the reason, one of the reasons why Genghis Khan and Jammu Khan fall apart is because of this. Because Genghis Khan would get
Right.
everyone, all even people from humble birth or humble origin, to sit together on the same table, which Jammu Khan would resist. He didn't never really liked it. So it's the Yasa, which is like a codified set of laws which the Mongols had put down. So essentially, acceptance of different religions or people belonging to diverse creeds who could uh, get very high appointment in the military bureaucracy based on their abilities. So the Mughals inherit that. They introduced that in India as well. So we don't see a
Hmm.
similar system in the Safavids or in the Ottomans. Of course, they also were great empires. I'm not decrying or
Hmm.
limiting their importance in any way, but I'm just talking about in this sense at least. Also, the fact that they were the Mughals, Akbar onwards, were also getting themselves involved with non-Muslims, and to an extent that would make people even today, very orthodox-minded people even today, are very uncomfortable about what Akbar was doing or what the Mughals were doing.
Right.
I, in fact, read a very wonderful article. I think in August it had come out in the Dawn, where the understanding of the Mughals in Pakistan was being talked about, and then the
Hmm.
contrast was given that how the Mughals are seen as an Indian dynasty, just because of the fact that by the Orthodox sections, of course, I'm not saying that
Yeah, yeah,
it's a
we will get
universal.
to this as well. Yeah, we will, of course.
Yeah.
In fact, I have certain sort of Pakistan-specific questions as well for you
Right.
as we sort of tease out a few other points before we get to that. But
Right.
I just want
Right.
to address briefly a question that
Mm.
I'm told that has arisen even as we do this discussion, this broadcast, which is that why are we having this discussion primarily in English? Now, of
Mm.
course, I could have
Mhm.
chosen theoretically
Mm.
to do this in Urdu, and you could have sort of played along, but my guess is the reason why we have to do this in English is, of course, to make it more inclusive because there are people
Mhm.
tuning in from India and from Pakistan whose first language is not Urdu or Hindi? What about
Right.
someone who, for example, whose first language is Pashto, or someone whose first language is Balochi? We don't want to make this too sort of inaccessible to people, and people from the southern part of India, for example, I imagine they would not be
Right.
too delighted if we were to just make this into sort of like one of those scenes from Jodha Akbar, where I'm going to be speaking like
Mhm.
this very sort of formal, Persianized,
Right.
Arabized sort of,
Absolutely. Very, very
courtly thing, and
ahistorical
then
though.
it would,
uh,
and
yeah.
we'll also talk about how historical that is actually. We'll get to that as well. And then you're sort of
Yeah.
responding in sort of like this very sort of Sanskritized, perhaps, Hindi.
Mhm.
That's not the kind of thing we want to do. So we are left with
Mhm.
no option but to resort to our colonizers'
Mhm.
language for the sake of basic inclusivity. Are you
Yeah.
on board with that framing of the
Absolutely.
problem the way I've
I
done
am.
it, right?
Oh yes,
So I hope
absolutely. Why
that
not?
so I hope this answers the question that people have raised, and moving
Mhm.
on from that. So
Mhm.
now let's get to the core of uh, what, for me at least, uh, reading through parts of your book made it so interesting, is that you, while you're performing, of course, a historian's task, you're also not at all shy of addressing contemporary sort of political issues and cultural issues and problems and anxieties and so on. It's almost as if you sort of do this very interesting style of writing where you sort of flip between the past and the present. And so just one moment you might be talking about sort of Akbar's policy towards the Rajputs, for instance, just an example. And the next moment you'll be talking about something that the BJP or the Congress have done sort of, in
Mhm.
today's India. That makes it very sort of course, interesting and engaging. So uh, given that he is a pre-modern autocrat, as you yourself mentioned, right,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, and he was in such a vastly different political, moral, economic, cultural sort of landscape from ours today, do you think there are any takeaways from Akbar's legacy that can actually help us today address 21st century South Asian sort of problems, especially of authoritarianism, of fundamentalism, of anxieties over
Mhm.
identity, and so on and so forth? Could you perhaps sort of comment on that?
Oh yes, absolutely. And I'm just adding to what you had asked earlier. One of the things that they did was that the ability to practice your religion freely. A lot of people from the Safavid and the Ottoman empires would flee, especially from the Safavid Empire, and come to the Mughal Empire, because, as you know, that the Safavids, they forcibly converted the population from Sunni to Shia, large sections of them. So, and that was a very violent process that the Safavids did. And the contrast you see in Mughal India, where Akbar is talking about not making slaves out of defeated people, not forcing them to convert. I think that is quite a contrast, isn't it? And today, when we see that the fact that, see, in Akbar's own personal life, or his immediate circle, where he got together an eclectic bunch of people, you could say the entire left liberal people of the time, even though those categories did not exist. So all kinds
Yeah,
of free thinking people had assembled around the personage of the emperor, right?
right.
So you had people like Raja Man Singh, for instance. Man Singh was pretty orthodox in his views, but he loved the emperor, and the emperor called him his son, Farzand, the first Mughal noble to have been promoted to the rank of a Haft Hazari Mansabdar, which is like the highest rank in Akbar's time for a non-prince or somebody not from the royal blood to attain. So Man Singh got that title. And you see people like Abul Fazl, people like Sheikh Mubarak,
Right.
Faizi, Abul Faizi. So these are the people he is mingling with, Birbal, and various Abdodarmal. So these are the people he's having conversations with on a regular basis, is getting ideas from them. And they're also yes men, pretty much. They also say things which the emperor wants to hear
Hmm.
on many occasions. But of course, there's a very
Absolutely.
close
Yeah.
bond, you see. And the emperor gets very hurt when Faizi dies. He's like heartbroken, and he's the most shocked when Birbal dies. In a campaign, and for years after that, because his body was never found. So there were rumors, and people would come forward, all kinds of quacks would come forward and say that, oh, I've seen Birbal there. And the emperor would give him 1,000 mohar or 100 mohar reward, and then send a campaign out in search of him. So it's a very human emperor, right? Who loves people irrespective of their faith. So I think that is quite remarkable and something that we expect from our rulers today. In India as well as in Pakistan, I think what we are seeing is in the last few years is a hardening of stance coming from those in power. Essentially, that's how the subcontinent has always been. People who are in power, who are issuing policies or issuing orders, they are the ones who actually are the movers of ideas. How the country is supposed to behave. I have no hesitation in saying this, that when we started off in 1947 in my country, I'm not talking about Pakistan, I'm strictly focusing on India, we had a tremendous head start, right? So we had rulers who had been part of the freedom struggle, and who came out of that and who believed in a certain idea, in a very inclusive idea. They saw partition, and despite that, they chose to stick to a certain path, that this country is for all. And that again is Akbar Sulhekul, by the way. So they continued with that. India, as you know, we have secularism enshrined in the preamble of the constitution, right? So we are a secular, socialist, democratic republic. And the Indian idea of secularism varies from the European idea of secularism. The Indian idea of secularism is essentially Akbar Sulhekul, peace for all, equidistant. Yeah. So we have not been able to articulate a refined version of Akbar Sulhekul. So we have chosen to stick to being a pluralistic polity. So in today's times, yes, there are tensions. There are groups that feel emboldened that a certain kind of narrative is now in place, which tries to take you away from the path that we embarked on. So I think that is why the story of Akbar becomes very important. Of course, I have said this in my book, that a 16th century emperor should not be guiding a 21st century democratic republic. I've said this earlier. But of course, there are certain things, and not just about Akbar, but also us, people in the subcontinent, the society that we have. We are also medieval in many ways. We even though we function in the 21st century, but some of the things that we do, some of the things that we believe in are very early modern or late medieval, if I may say so. I have actually said this in my book. And in that respect, at least what a 16th century emperor did, not discriminating on the basis of religion, race, and not trying to create a common platform for everyone to stand together. You could have your own god, different gods, but of course you need to your loyalty comes to the status. So he was also trying to enforce an idea. Of course, we don't see him as a liberal monarch that way, but he was also a patriarch. So he was all of that. But he was also very remarkably open-minded for his time. So I think if these are some of the things that we can remember, that we were always people who lived together side by side. We did have our conflicts, we did have our problems. There were communal problems as well in Akbar's time. But the moment the ruling authority takes a side and says, no, this is not going to be tolerated, then you see the rippling effect that trickles down, right? So that's how rulers decide the destinies of their countries. In 1947, we did that. So we need to keep reminding, I keep telling this to my friends here in India, that we need to keep reminding ourselves that this is the legacy that we inherited. We need to stick to that, because this is a very modern idea as well. But at the same time, this is something that has always worked in India's case, which is our conditions are very different from Europe. We are all kinds of people. We have here people speaking different languages, following different faiths. How do you keep such diverse people united? Only if you respect their diversity, right? Only if you allow them these freedoms. In Akbar's time, we see that there are several Shia leaders who are saying that there's no need to hide your Shia identity anymore, because now we have an emperor, in whose kingdom we can freely profess our faith. I'll also give you the example of somebody, a foreign traveler who comes, an Englishman who comes when Jahangir is the emperor, and then he go on Friday namaz. He climbs the pulpit when this thing is going on, and then he says certain things against the faith. And then he climbs down and nobody does him anything. And then he's surprised completely. He says that in any other country, I would have been ripped apart for abusing the religion of the people. But here, nothing happened to me. So you see that kind of acceptance that we see in Akbar's empire, which I think sets him apart, not just from his from his contemporaries, but even today when we look at how things are headed in both our countries.
Right. So we actually now of course people also, there's the elephant in the room when you're talking about Akbar, which is
Mhm.
of course the so-called Dine-e-Ilahi and so on, and we'll of course get to that
Yeah.
in a bit. But there's just one or two more things that I was hoping that we can talk about before we sort of get to that. Uh,
Mhm.
and you've touched upon this, but if you could just sort of give us a more precise idea of, can we say that contemporary India has a problem with the
Mhm.
Mughals in general and with Akbar in particular? You've touched upon this. So, to what extent is there actually sort of discomfort with Akbar in particular? I mean, wouldn't we
Mhm.
expect there to be more of a problem with, as you touched upon the idea with, with Aurangzeb and sort of more acceptance
Mhm.
of Akbar? So, what is it
Mhm.
about contemporary Indian politics that actually drives the discomfort with Akbar? If you could
Mhm.
perhaps, talk a bit about that.
Well, in today's times, given the political climate that we have, and this is pretty much a move by politics, then by, I mean, these are not very spontaneous feelings that people have. These have been
Hmm.
generated, created, drummed up for political objectives. And so the Mughals, of course, the understanding of the Mughals has changed substantially over the years. And but even then, we see that. Let's say in the 19th century, when we start noticing that there are clear cut conflicts and fault lines between Hindus and Muslims in India, especially in northern India, we do see that. And we do have this Hindi Urdu debate that happens in the 19th century. Then we see the cow protection movement that starts towards the end of the 19th century, 1880s and 1890s. That's the period. And you see the kind of hateful rhetoric that starts coming out from the right-wing groups, especially Hindu right-wing groups. They start vilifying Muslim dynasties of the past, also the Mughals, but not so much Akbar. In fact, Akbar is used very positively. So a cow protection movement essentially was a demand made by these Orthodox Hindu groups to the colonial administration that there should be a law to prohibit slaughter of cows because that's hurtful towards Hindus. And they gave the example of Akbar doing that. So they invoked Akbar, as you see. So you could talk about Mughals, say nasty things about them. Not so many nasty things as they do now, but even then, Aurangzeb was a bad guy for them, even then. But here you see that Akbar was being used. He was being invoked. That the colonial administration was appealed to. That see, our emperor Akbar had done this for us. Since you have inherited the rule from the Mughals, you should also do the same. Right. So you see that Akbar's idea there. You see, by the time we come to the 1940s, and in fact, my book starts with an example from 1941, where I talk about a resident from Bombay writing to the editor of the Times of India. And 1941, as you know, is a very critical year in India at that time, in Indian history, and also in world history because the war was on. But in India, after 1940, after the Lahore Declaration, Congress and Muslim League were not on good terms anymore. So a lot of things had happened at that time. So here's this Bombay resident, a Hindu, who writes a letter to the Times of India editor saying that today we need an Akbar, to
Hmm.
unite and keep this huge country together, to keep different people together. We need an Akbar. And you see that after that, what happens? 1980s, 90s onward, we see that now certain things are being said about Emperor Akbar as well, negative things, okay? And by the time the internet boom happens in the 2000s, suddenly you have these NRIs who are non-resident Indians, techies, most of them, with very little idea about what history is like, who start sending these forward emails where all the glory about India is talked about, and then suddenly you find that there's either no mention of the Mughals or any other Muslim dynasty, or there is a negative mention of them, and as if they were to be blamed for all the modern problems of India. And gradually we come to the time in 2015 when there's a campaign on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, where everyone is saying that Akbar was as bad as Adolf Hitler. Therefore, you need to change the name of Akbar Road in Delhi, because would you have a Hitler Road in Berlin? So that is the kind of example that was being given. So you see that over the years, it has changed completely. And that's simply because history has been heavily communalized for the sake of politics. In India, 89, 90 onwards, we see this bad phase where, everything, every received knowledge was questioned, which essentially is not a bad thing, but of course that should be grounded in scholarship, not on loony ideas, right? So when you say things like the
Right.
Taj Mahal was a Hindu temple, I mean, of course, you have to be really loony to be able to say something like that, when the whole world knows what it is. And now we come to this stage where, it's almost impossible to talk anything even remotely positive about the Mughals. It's not possible to properly appraise them without incurring the wrath of trolls. And if this thing is going live right now, then you would find that in the comment section, there'll be many people who will start attacking me, or when I share this on Twitter, they'll start attacking me. So anyone who says even remotely anything positive about the Mughals will get a lot of hate. So I think that is the situation that we are living today. And it's not a nice thing, but that's how the understanding has changed. And India, as of now, does seem to have a problem, at least when it comes to the official narrative, or people aligned to communal groups. Have I lost you? Okay, either my connection has failed, or Ziyad has failed. Okay, waiting. Okay, is this thing still on? Ziyad seems to have dropped out. Okay, I'm here. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Olikara. I'm just going through the comments till the time Ziyad joins back. And
Internet connection problem. I'm not sure how long I was out, but well,
okay.
Internet connection
Okay.
in Southeast.
Okay. Okay.
So
Glad
where
to have
were
you
we
back.
in our discussion? Yeah. You were talking where
I actually forgot what I was saying, because I talk too much. As you see, once I start, I can't seem to finish.
I'll just bring you back to the point where I sort of lost you. Okay, so you were talking about the fact that sort of people should, of course, question sort of things that they've received as sort of conventional wisdom about the past, but perhaps not on the basis of what you described as loony ideas, such as, for example, you mentioned one that the Taj Mahal was actually some sort of Hindu temple on which things had been done. So that is sort of where you were before I lost my internet connection, for which I'm truly sorry.
That's what I was saying, essentially, that there has to be a revisionist history is always welcome. And academia also accepts that, but that has to be grounded in scholarship, not on myths and legends and dogma and imaginative stuff, right? So this is, I mean, there was this tendency, it still continues, where every Muslim monument, and in fact, we are seeing this increasingly in India. So earlier, there used to be gossip. These conversations used to be limited to certain circles. Now, of course, they are being aired openly without any fear. And they say that every building built by Muslims in India and elsewhere, not just in India, were actually non-Muslim originally. So, so this is the kind of thing that we are
Right.
stuck with. And it's kind of amazing because the maximum number of scholarship after the United States that comes out on the Mughals is India. And it also shows how divorced academia is from popular history, or academic history is from popular history. People don't want to read. Even when they read, they don't want to believe that, okay, they think that, okay, this must have been some conspiracy by left and Marxist historians to,
Right.
deny us the real knowledge. so so I think that's what is happening in India right now. I'm sure we'll have enough examples in your country as well, which you will be more familiar with than I am.
Which brings us to the issue, right? So as I said, there is an elephant in the room when one talks about Akbar, which is, of course, his somewhat unconventional attitudes towards sort of religion, or at least towards orthodoxy. But before I go into this, I would like to remind the audience on the Pakistani sort of side of, the discussion, that they must remember that when to the best of my knowledge, when the founder of the country, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was actually asked as to what sort of model he had in his mind for sort
Yes.
of, an ideal sort of rule for Pakistan, for what sort of principles on which, not ideal rule directly, but the sort of principles on which he would operate,
Hmm.
in terms of communal relations, he actually cites
Hmm.
Akbar. He actually says that is the concept of justice that we're looking for. And I remember having cited this to certain sort of, sort of hardcore nationalists, and they were like, no, no, of course not, this couldn't be possible. And then when I showed them because it's there, it's on a government website, that I showed them, I said, well, here you go. And, they're like, but of course, you've done some sort of, it's actually a bit similar to the kind of thing that you face from sort of right-wing sort of ideologues on your
Right.
side. They're like, of course, you somehow hacked into that government website and sort of changed that speech or that history. So that happens. There's also, of course, the fact that someone such as Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, for example, who is certainly, fairly orthodox, at least in his religious views. He, after all, was from the Deoband school. He nevertheless sees Akbar's religious moves as being the only way to handle all the diversity and the challenges posed by sort of, pluralism in the South Asian context.
Hmm.
But I want to ask you, and this is something that I've seen a lot of discussions in Pakistan sort of struggle with when it comes to Akbar, right? Perhaps you could help us with this. I remember, I mean, our friends at the Mughal Imperial Archives, I mean, I've seen them struggling with people. They're just saying, for God's sake, try to understand what Akbar actually believed in before you sort of come out with your fatwa, right? Which is fine. And fatwas, of course, but people are like, no, I know what he said, and fatwas, of course, are beyond the scope of our discussion. None of us being sort of, qualified in doing that, or interested or in doing that either. But for the purpose of the discussion, can you help us to understand how sort of far out from the orthodoxy were sort of Akbar's views on religion? Did he actually attempt to create a new religion? Did he actually sort of at some point cease to be a Muslim? Did he stop being one? And remembering, of course, that in Pakistan, the mainstream view of him has been colored by the view of, frankly, of Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi, who's known as
Yes.
Mujaddid al-Fsani. And, he's and as I always point out to people who cite him, I say, well, are you sure that you stand by all of the things that he had to say about various sects and so on? So anyhow, in your view, before one passes a judgment, a modern religious theological judgment on Akbar, what are the things that we need to know, that a Muslim audience needs to know about what Akbar believed in actually? What did the man actually believe, and what did he not believe?
Okay. So, organized religion always wants a certain kind of cohesion, right? So you would expect people to behave in a certain way. Everyone should believe in the same ideals. It's just that it doesn't always happen in real life, what you wish or what you intend to do and what actually happens on the ground. I think all rulers, and I have seen this because my next work is on the Delhi Sultanate. So I've seen several sultans of Delhi also struggle with the orthodoxy because you have eventually, essentially there are people, very powerful people, who will do things they think is right or they think is important for their kingdom, for their empire. So they may not always conform to what the scriptures say or what your religion expects you to do. And we also need to understand that the understanding of religion itself has changed over the years, right? So in this, for instance,
Right.
what Islam was like in the 12th century, in the 13th century, is very different from the understanding of Islam that we have today. So all faiths have also gone through that evolution. So all faiths, and not just Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, all of us have
Right.
gone through this process. Akbar, of course, was as an individual, as a very powerful individual, as a thinking individual. He had his own ideas about life, right? But at the same time, he
Right.
also had to negotiate his relationship with the orthodoxy, because you could not have possibly gone completely against them, right? So we have this charge leveled against Akbar that he wanted to start a new faith, and that he did start a
Mhm.
new faith, which is often called Din Ilahi. Din Ilahi, of course, the term itself came much later, not in Akbar's own lifetime. Okay, so
It was never
something
used
like
in his
Tawheed,
lifetime.
yeah, no, it was not. It was not used in his
Mhm.
lifetime. It's much later construct. Now the thing
Right.
is, it was not essentially a religion. We don't see it as a religion. Historians, by and large, are uniform in their opinion that it was never a religion. It was kind of a fellowship, kind of a Sufi fellowship sort of a thing, where you had the Piro Murshid as the emperor, and he had his own
Right.
circle of disciples, his followers. And Akbar was not original in this, by the way. So it was a concept that he borrowed from the Safavids, because the Safavids, you have to understand, they were Sufis. It was a Sufi order
Right.
that became that assumed political power
A tariqat.
or
Yeah.
kingship. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and so it's something that he got from them and which he learned, because see, you have to understand that they were also interacting. There was much intellectual engagement
Mhm.
that was happening. Ideas are never static. They don't remain in the same place. They tend to flow. They're not dependent on modern means of communication. They were always flowing, right? So
Right.
Akbar was a Sunni. There's no doubt about that. He died a Sunni.
Okay.
He did not abandon his faith.
Right.
And yes, he did have doubts in his mind from time to time. In fact, from his name, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, in some of his later farmans, he removed Muhammad from that. So, and this is something that even Jahangir did. And I think that is something that it's possible for people to do. I mean, various people feel differently about religion at different points in time, right? So I may have believed
Right.
in something when I was much younger. My views are very different today. So we have to
Mhm.
see him in that context. And he never abandoned his faith. He always tried to be a good Muslim. First 15, 16 years of his 17 years, in fact, every year he goes to the Dargah of Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti. Okay. There were political reasons for that, of course. He wanted to give across an impression that he was a very orthodox, good Muslim. He would pray 5 times a day. So people don't know these things. That's why they say that, okay, he had abandoned faith and then he became heretic and all that. He was not like that. He, in fact, did not convert to Christianity, even though the Jesuit padres, they thought that they were on the verge of converting him. He said that, I have my own beliefs. I got this religion. I will not convert, but my children are free to choose their faith. So if you want to convince them, feel free, go ahead. The women of the family did not like that, of course. So that's a different story altogether. They didn't
Right.
like that. They didn't like that sort of an openness. So that was something that was no go.
Right.
But Akbar did not find a different religion, but he was a very human king, which is something which we need to remember. And I find it fascinating because humans evolve. They're not static people. They're not fixed people, right? So he was different when he was 13 when he became the emperor. He was different when he was
Right.
23. He was different when he was 33, when he was 43. So you see that this constant evolution in his views. And also remember one fact, that he came in touch with people from different faiths. He started marrying Hindu women very early, right? And started observing their practices. So his worldview changed, and essentially he was surrounded in a majority Hindu society, right? So, and he adopted the scriptures. He was very interested in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Hindu scriptures. In fact, he was very, very curious to know, because Akbar was often compared to an avatar of Vishnu. So he was referred to as Lord Ram. He was referred to as Krishna Avatar.
Right.
Kaushalya Putra, the Jains, the Rajputs, they were all calling him as the avatar of Vishnu. So he was very curious to know about the Ramayana.
Right.
And whom did he entrust the responsibility of translating the Ramayana to Farsi? Mullah Abdul Qadir Badauni, who is in so many ways very orthodox, bigoted at times, but Akbar thought that he was the right man for the job. So you see that he was a man of his times, a very remarkable man, no doubt, very ahead of his time in many ways. But for people of the faith who think that he left it, you should know that he never did anything like that. He was a free man. It's just that he refused to subject his reasoning to dogmas of faith. So he would not do things just because it's written in the scriptures. He would do things only if he thought it was practical, if it could be demonstrated logically. That's what the Portuguese Jesuits also complain. Portuguese Jesuits, later on, when the account is written of their mission, Pierre du Jarric is a French Jesuit priest. He says that this man has all the flaws of an atheist. So they all perceive him that way. But he was a Muslim, he always was, thought of himself as a Muslim, and the idiom of his kingship was Islamic. There's no doubt about that. So I think this debate actually is not grounded on facts.
Right. Now, before we move on to the questions one or two of the questions that my colleagues have sort of selected from some of the very interesting comments that we've received over the course of this discussion. Now, I just was hoping to touch upon the more earthy side to Akbar, which is, I think, an issue that you and I have talked about among ourselves a lot, and this is something that fascinates people about Akbar, because people have this impression, perhaps, that he was sort of like always in sort of this formal sort of Hrithik Roshan playing Jodha Akbar sort of mode, where, it's all like takhliya, whereas actually we see, for example, when he executes, the unpleasant Adam Khan, his foster brother, he throws him to death, and I can never forget how it says in the original Persian source, and I will quote that, and I will not translate it. I will leave it to our audience. But he actually says,
it says, please do the toot part when you come to that word. Okay.
I will, absolutely. I will do an exaggerated bleep, when I get to that part. But the Persian actually says that, when Akbar throws Adam Khan, he actually, the source says, Hazrat Bazaban Hindustani Famudand ke ay censored. Bleep. Okay. So he literally calls him a swear word, which, which starts with a G. I mean, I will not go beyond that. And it's something we commonly now today use in Hindi, in Urdu, and so on.
Absolutely.
And so you have, right. So, and you mentioned so many other episodes of what sort of person, what sort of guy, if you'll excuse me for using that term, Akbar was. Was he sort of like a very sort of chill person in his everyday life, or was he sort of like, that Hrithik Roshan image of like,
he was certainly not
did he ever let his hair down?
Oh yes, of course, all the time. So you see, people have seen him wearing the lungi, being bare-chested, doing patangbazi on the terrace of his palace. Okay, so Rafiuddin Shirazi, who comes to Agra, he sees the emperor, and so there's this incident when the Ottoman emissary is coming, and Akbar creates a pavilion in his honor. And Rafiuddin Shirazi at that time, he was passing through Agra, and he was there at that moment. So a lot of people suddenly gathered, and slogans of Badshah Salamat were raised. Okay? And he got curious. He wanted to know what was happening. He couldn't spot anything out of the ordinary. So he was stunned. And then he asked somebody that they are saying Badshah Salamat, where is the Badshah? It was pointed out that he's there. He's right there. And he was completely aghast to see a man, wearing very ordinary clothes, half sleeve vest and very loose pajamas. And he's standing close to another person. And he's standing close to another person and has placed his hand or her head on his hand, and the hand is rested on the shoulder of this other man. So, and he asks, what sort of a man is this? I mean, does this court not have any etiquette, any custom where, the emperor behaves a bit differently from the rest. And then somebody tells him that our emperor is very unconventional. He keeps coming out of the palace and meets us, in these informal settings. So it becomes very difficult to observe etiquette and manners and all that when in such a close setting. Right? So you see that, and then the same man sees Akbar flying the kite, being bare-chested, wearing just a lungi and flying kites on the terrace of his palace. And as this particular incident that you mentioned, the execution of Adham Khan, and Abul Fazl also uses a gali. He says that Akbar was so enraged that he called Adham Khan Bacha-e-Lada, which means son of a bitch or son of a fool, whatever it is. Son of a bitch is more likely. And Bayazid Bayat, of course, is the other one. The extract that you mentioned comes from Bayazid Bayat, and he says, Hazrat Bazaban, Hindui Farbudan ke e ... Chera atka mora kushti. So why did you kill my atka? And he uses this very modern gali, right? So Akbar had a bad temper. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. And also he did certain things. He would ask all kinds of questions which were very strange, which would appear very strange, but actually very important in many ways. For instance, he would be curious, and I'm saying this because I believe we have an adult audience, that he would be curious why the insistence is always on people having a bath after having sex, then having a bath before having sex. So these are the things that Akbar talks about. Right? These are the questions that he has. So why should everyone wash up after having sex? It should be people washing up before having sex. Then he also says things like, he talks about very important things, of course. He talks about daughters inheriting property. These are things which eventually we have managed to do much later in modern times. But Akbar was talking about all those things. Chilled out, yes, no doubt. He marries all kinds of women, and later on in his life, he says that maybe I should not have married so many women, and certainly not women from my own empire, because they are like my daughters, because I'm their father, being the emperor. These are very weird things to come from him. But I do see that, and plus the drunken parties that he used to have, and the drunken brawls were like amazing, out of the ordinary. So after his victory over the Mirzas in Gujarat, Akbar has drinks with his very close courtiers. Am I audible? Is my video still there? I think somebody's has got stuck, either Ziyad's or mine. Mine should be okay. If one of our audience members could give a okay. Ziyad, anyone? Can you hear me? Okay, it's working fine. Okay, great. Take care. So I think we have lost Ziyad again. So I was just continuing with that, and so Akbar has this has drinks with his coterie of nobles, and then these Rajput nobles, they go for these tales of bravery. They exaggerate things. Of course, they say that we Rajputs are so brave that when two Rajputs want to have a fight, they would impale themselves on a spear, come very close so that nobody can trouble them or interfere, and have a sword duel. Can you hear me? I think we lost you in between.
Yes, absolutely. I can hear you. There was a brief moment where there was a problem with my internet connection, but yeah, I'm back.
Okay. So I was just talking about this incident in Gujarat, where after having this victory, they have drinks at night, and then they have a party, and everyone is talking nonsense basically. And two of Akbar's Rajput nobles, they talk exaggerated stuff about their bravery, how Rajputs are so brave. And they say that, we Rajputs are so brave, when two warriors want to fight, they will impale themselves on a spear, come very close to each other so that there can be no intervention. And then they will have the sword duel. And Akbar, in that state of drunken stupor, he suddenly stands up and says that, oh, I am also a brave Rajput. Okay, I'm as brave as a Rajput. So I'm going to do something like that. So he fixes a sword on the seal of a window, and then he tries to run into it. And everyone is like aghast. They think that because everyone knows that this is all rubbish, but they never expected the emperor to take it seriously. And eventually Man Singh saves him. So he knocks that sword off, and then of course Akbar gets so angry that he almost throttles Man Singh, and so yeah, so these are very fun incidents from Akbar's life, which
Yeah,
I
yeah,
find very fascinating
yeah. He
completely.
was clearly a fun
Uh,
guy. Uh, yeah. So we need to wrap up our discussion, but before we do that, we do have to take at least some of the questions from our audience, and of course,
mhm,
from in particular from our friends at the Mughal Imperial Archives, because they've been sending some very nice questions as we have this discussion. We've touched
okay.
upon some of these issues, but you could perhaps address them.
Mhm,
If we could just combine both of their questions, even though they're not so combinable, perhaps. But first,
mhm,
they ask if you could explain whether there are sort of exaggerated interpretations regarding Akbar's policies by Mullah Badawi. Now, he's a very
mhm,
important primary source on Akbar's reign, of course,
mhm,
and I'm sure someone who you also sort of grappled with. Uh, so,
mhm,
so they're asking what his intent was and what his motivations were in dealing with
mhm.
Akbar, and because he's a source of some of the sort of criticisms
Mhm.
or the misunderstandings of Akbar as well, right? That we still go
Right.
along with today. So, what was going on
Right.
with Mullah Badawi? Why was he, having such a hard time dealing with, with the emperor?
So, the interpretation of historians tends to be different. I think Ali Anusaher has written a whole article on this. It's an academic article on Badauni and why we should not always see him as a bigot. Maybe he was just a rebel against authority. So we also need to remember that. So I think that's one important piece that you should have a look whenever you have the time. But of course,
Hmm.
Akbar was doing things which was being perceived by different people differently. Okay, for instance, the way he was using Islamic formulations, he puts Allahu Akbar in his coins, on his seal, and that is, of course, immediately resisted by the more orthodox elements in his court. And of course, immediately Badauni also makes the connection that, of course, the emperor is trying to, you know, uh, project himself as if he's also a divine. He's also a divinity. So that is something which was noticed by Badauni and by others as well. But of course, not just Badauni. You see, even Rafiuddin Shirazi thought that probably he was not being reverential enough to the prophet, and maybe he had other ideas about what the fate should be like. And Badani also says that in fact Akbar had rejigged the kalma, so which of course was only circulated within his palace. But we see, and there's in fact the whole khutbah which was read by Akbar. In fact, started reading it himself, but he could not complete it. He started shaking, and then he had to hand it over to someone else. And that khutbah is very interesting because it appears as if they are trying to please Akbar while trying to raise him to that status. So these things
Hmm.
definitely created doubts in public minds. And Barani, of course, we do have to take into account that he was probably exaggerating a few things, but at the same time, there are other sources that are available that also hint towards the same thing. For instance, there are letters that Akbar exchanged. But in fact, when Jahangir or Salim he rebels, he makes a promise to the orthodoxy that I'm going to reopen the mosques that my father had closed down, and some of the unfortunate things that my father has done when it comes to observing the true faith. Um, so you do make out that he was doing certain things, and then of course his
So,
his
had he
letters
gone
to
on
him.
a mosque closing spree? I'm sorry, that's
Yes,
just too interesting a point that you raised. If it were, did he
yes.
actually go on a mosque closing spree, and then Jahangir had to actually
I
sort of
won't. I'm
reopen
not
them?
sure
Is
if
that
it
the
was a
case? Because he's also
spree.
built mosques.
Yes, he did, of course. I'm not too sure if it was a spree. It may have been just one or two incidents, which of course have been talked about. And Badani, in fact, mentions that mosques were now being turned into guardhouses for Hindus, um, and things like that.
Hmm.
And there are letters that, in fact, there's also another incident. I think it's there in my book where he writes a letter to Daniel, who's the governor at that time of the Deccan, And
Mhm.
Daniel asks him, people, what do I tell people who want to offer namaz? Do I stop them or do I let them continue? Akbar says that
Mhm.
you should not never force people to do anything. Just try to show them that maybe the rational path may be a bit different, but don't force anyone to do anything. So these are things that we see. There are instances. I'm not sure if these were quite widespread, but there may have been one or two incidents like that, and the reason for that is not very well known, uh, at least not known to me, uh,
Mhm.
why he exactly did that. But
Right.
Badauni does talk about that, and he also says that people having Muslim names, especially those in working in the palace, Akbar was forcing them to change their names into more neutral sounding names. So this is also something interesting which I found, which also Badauni mentions. To what extent all of that is true is very hard to guess, because it's just one source which is telling us all this. So he may have an axe to grind. Who knows? Uh, but Akbar
And
was
he does
different
seem
in
to have
many
an axe
ways.
to grind, right?
Yes, yes, he does. He does. But
He
definitely,
does. He
there's
does
no
have an axe
doubt
to
that
grind, right?
Akbar had a love-hate relationship with the orthodoxy and with organized religion for
Mhm.
sure. And he also was disapproving of many of these Hindu practices as well, the social evils like sati and child infanticide, all of that. So it's not just that he was against
Yeah.
one. He was kind of against all kinds of dogmas. So he was not always following them. So yeah, if that answers the question.
Yeah. We have, because people are interested in films and so on, and Akbar has
Mm.
been depicted in at least a few films. We have Mughal Azam, we have Jodha Akbar, we
Mhm.
have, we have others. We have,
Mhm.
I think we have a TV series at least. We have even those cartoons with
Mhm.
with Akbar and Birbal and so on, that I often watch on flights when I have nothing else
Mhm.
to do. Uh, we have a
Uh,
question here, which is slightly off the topic of Akbar, but is sort of relevant to the issue of the depiction of Mughals in
mhm.
contemporary India and in Bollywood. So we have a viewer who asks if you think that Karan Johar's movie Takht might be expected to do a better job of depicting Aurangzeb, for instance, or the Mughals in general, and whether it will sort of do justice to the Mughals in the way that, according to the viewer, Audrey Trushker did to the character of Aurangzeb. Do you think? I mean, that we can hope
Well,
for something interesting from that film depiction?
I think the person is very optimistic. Uh, you can't expect Karan Johar to do an Audrey Trushke. I mean, academic history is very different from popular history. So, people like Rajiv
Right.
Kinra have written about Chandrabhan Pandit, who belonged to Aurangzeb's empire and who talked about so many things in his account. So, uh, he was definitely far more complex than the simplistic understanding that we have of Aurangzeb. I don't expect any
Hmm.
objectivity in this movie, because I hear that
Right.
Ranveer Singh is going to play Dara Shoko, so and Vicky Kaushal is going to play Aurangzeb. I don't know if they are going to retain that original star
Hmm.
cast that they had announced, but you can pretty much imagine,
Right.
if it's Ranveer Singh, he is going to be the guy who will get the most sympathy out of it, because he will be the main hero, and Vicky Kaushal will be the Aurangzeb. So it's going to be a cartoon villain versus an overblown hero. So I think that is my expectation from this movie. I don't expect anything positive, and certainly not in this environment. See, Jodha Akbar was still possible because it was 2008. We did not have communalism as widespread as it is today. Okay, we do not have
Hmm.
members of the ruling party saying nasty things about icons of the past. Tipu Sultan, Alauddin Khilji, and Aurangzeb were not electoral issues back then. So their names would not be
Hmm.
taken by leaders while fighting their elections or asking people to vote. threatening people that if they vote for the rival party, then the rule of Tipu Sultan and Aurangzeb and Alauddin Khilji will be back. So it's a very different India that we are living in today. In 2008, it was still possible to make a Jodha Akbar. I'm not too sure how far optimistic I should be from Takht. Of course, it's going to be a visual spectacle for sure, because Karan Johar he has a thing for very grand things, very desi, gharelu depictions of things. So I'm sure it will make the Mughals appear. I mean, the only thing positive that I'm looking at is the Mughals will appear as very Indian, very gharelu, very sas bahu kind of characters that many people in India are quite accustomed to. So I think that's how they're going to appear as, which I think may not necessarily be a bad thing. But when it comes to objective portrayal, I'm not too sure if I should be expecting that from Takht or from any other movie. Not for a very long time, till the time when things change and we are once again in a position to talk about amity and talk about pluralism and all these things, unity and diversity, which we don't often talk about nowadays. So yeah, that's my answer.
Right. And my final question is not so much from the audience, but more from myself, and you need not go into too much detail here. This is not necessarily the most serious question that I'm asking, or then again, I don't know. But if you were to speculate, right? Purely if you were to speculate, as an author, as a researcher who's looked in some great detail at Akbar's life, his worldview, and so on and so forth, if he was to somehow be transported to our era, a time machine or something, how do you think he would relate to these political divides and cultural anxieties in South Asia today? And what sort of politics do you imagine that he would align with in today's India and in today's Pakistan? Okay, so it would seem that we've lost.
Yes, no, I'm back.
Manimugdha
I think
Sharma.
I'm back.
But no, he's back.
I mistakenly clicked on something which took me out of the studio. So yeah, something had popped up. I clicked on it.
Yeah,
so
we lost
I just got logged. Yeah.
Ah.
So I got your question. So you're asking a very.
What sort of politics do you think he would?
What sort of a politics would Akbar profess? That's what you're asking.
What do you think he would align with in today's India and in today's Pakistan? What sort of politics do you imagine if he were to be transported to our era with his sort of attitudes, with his tendencies, with his, preferences? What do you imagine this guy doing sort of today?
Well.
And I know you can't also answer this with any objectivity, of course, knowing, of course,
Yeah, I mean, of course, I would want to.
So
I do see certain things which are similar in Akbar and certain things that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru tried to do when India became independent. So I would want him to be that sort of a monarch. And you see, it all depends on the understanding of the time, right? So history, we have to understand. Our understanding of the past is shaped by our present. That has always been the case. So when Pandit Nehru was writing Discovery of India and heaping praises on Akbar, it was his modern reality, his modern understanding of the past that was speaking. When Adi Munshi, the person who wrote that letter to the editor of the Times of India, when he was writing, he was wishing for an Akbar in the 20th century. He was again talking about from his modern understanding of Akbar. So Akbar, we have to understand, he was a ruthless monarch. And somebody, empire building is a gut-wrenching process. You can't have bloodless empires, right? Unless, of course, you're talking about the Sufis who would claim their vilayat, which, of course, is in constant competition with the temporal power of the Sultan. So unless you're doing that, every empire has resulted from bloody conquests, right? So Akbar would have been a ruthless politician, perhaps. He would do things. He would perhaps not regret sending his armies to crush down rebellions and all that. which he did. So just keeping in mind the historical Akbar. So he would probably, given the sensibilities and the kind of politics that we practice in the 21st century, where you can't really execute people at the drop of a hat, you don't have absolute power over life and death of people in the 21st century. Nobody does that. Not even the worst of dictators
Right.
do. There are always some semblance of check or some humanity that is expected, some minimum humanity that is expected.
Mm-hmm.
I would still like to believe, and this is my belief, doesn't have to be a very historically accurate belief, that he would have been somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, because of the fact that he was very eclectic and very open-minded in many ways, and still patriarchal.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think that's how I would understand. Yeah.
So a Congress progressive sort of guy in India, and
I would
as
think
someone.
so, yes, and certainly not a right-wing guy, because no right-wing guy talks about giving inheritance to women, or in fact, when the Hindu Code Bill was brought, was tabled, and it was being talked about in the 1950s, they met with a lot of resistance from the conservative section. So Akbar was doing something like that in his own time.
Right.
So ending slavery, for instance. So these are very modern things, isn't it? I mean, giving dignity to people, I think that is the most important word which I've missed so far. Treating people with dignity is what Akbar did. Giving people dignity is what he did. And I think that is important for any age. That is a lesson, that is a message for any age. And I think that makes him very relevant in some ways, in today's subcontinent at least.
Right. So I think that we have, and frankly, there's so many other issues that we could actually sort of go into potentially, especially because people are commenting, people are raising more questions. Some of those can be discussed, some of those cannot be discussed. But we have the constraints, of course, of our time and our format. So my guess is that we should probably, this is an opportune moment to close or wrap up our discussion sort of for now. But thank you so much for joining us. This was long overdue. We recorded something like this, in the pre-pandemic era, and then my computer sort of blew up, and sort of all sorts of bad things happened on my end. And
And I think we are doing it at the right time. The book has completed a year in circulation. Sadly enough, it has not been able to travel to Pakistan for obvious reasons. But hopefully at some point it would. But that has not limited many Pakistani readers to pick it up from other places or from online. And I have heard very good things from many people about it. And also, we are having this a day after Akbar's death anniversary. 27th of October is a day when Akbar died. So we are doing this on the 28th, so it's the day after. So I think it's just we're on the right time that we are doing this. So, but it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure being here on your show.
So I hope
it was lovely
that people. Yeah, I just hope that people actually, sort of having heard you talk about your work, people, especially in Pakistan as well, are inspired to actually sort of look at some of the historical work on the Mughals, if they're interested, because these are things, of course, that stir a lot of emotion, they stir a lot of interest, and I don't blame people for being interested, of course. And I hope that they have a look at your excellent and very engaging work. Thank you so much for joining us, Muk Sharma. It was such a pleasure and an honor to have you on board. And we are looking forward to having you join us on future broadcasts, because there's lots of current and past issues that we need to talk to you about. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to our audiences. And my apologies for the internet connection problems that we had.
That's not a problem at all. Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure. And as they say in Hindustan, Khuda Hafiz to all.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you so much. Thank you.